When KV unleashed its secret robotic strike on Moscow's billion-dollar shield, the world gasped. Because what happened next wasn't supposed to be possible. It began in silent, midnight sky stretched over Moscow, thick with winter fog. Then came the faintest hum, so soft it could be mistaken for the rustle of wind. But this was no ordinary night breeze. It was the eerie war of machines, small yet relentless, closing in on the heart of Russia's most guarded prize, the 1.3 billion Moscow defense tower. For years, this tower had been paraded as unbreakable. State television praised it as the invincible shield of the motherland. Generals boasted that no foreign hand could ever breach it. It was more than a building. It was a monument to power. To Putin's promise that Moscow stood untouchable, families in Moscow slept easy, believing their fortress could withstand anything. And then fire explosions tore through the night sky. A cascade of light over the capital skyline. Cameras on nearby rooftops caught the moment the tower shuttered. Its armor peeled back like paper. Flames licked upward. A billion-dollar symbol collapsing into chaos in real time. Within minutes, news anchors sat frozen. Mouth dry, eyes wide, social media erupted with disbelief. A viral post read, "If Moscow isn't safe." Nowhere is safe, even inside the Kremlin. Silence filled the corridors. The unthinkable had happened. The shield was broken, but this was no random strike. It wasn't brute force or conventional firepower that cracked the tower. Open it was something stranger, smaller, smarter, an army of robotic ghosts, crafted in desperation. And as Moscow burned, the world realized this was only the beginning of a war, fought not with tanks, but with machines born of necessity, defiance and survival for years. Moscow thrived under an illusion. Anchors on Russian state television declared with smug certainty that the capital was untouchable. Every parade, every broadcast. Every glossy magazine cover repeated the same chorus. Our skies are sealed, our defense is unbreakable. Our fortress eternal, the $1.3 billion defense tower, was their proof, gleaming against the skyline like a crown. Parents told their children they were safe. Soldiers believed the capital stood beyond reach. Moscow slept in comfort, swaddled in arrogance. But across the border in Ukraine, the nights were filled with a very different sound. Not the Hama parades or the Lola propaganda, but the terrifying whistle of missiles slicing the sky. Sirens wailed through Kyiv as families fled to underground shelters. Mothers pressed their children's ears shut to muffle the sound of distant blast. Schools went quiet, their classrooms turned into bunkers. Yet even in the darkest shelters, resilience burned. Children, instead of sketching flowers, began to draw drones in their notebooks, tiny symbols of a future fight. While Russia boasted about billion-dollar towers, Ukraine relied on the scraps of war. In basements lit by flickering bulbs, young engineers, students, hackers, dreamers huddled over salvaged electronics. They stripped down hobby drones, rewired toy circuits, and coded by candlelight. They were not generals in polished uniforms. They were ordinary citizens, transforming desperation into invention. Each whirring prototype was born from necessity, a weapon shaped not by wealth but by survival. This was the great contrast. One side wrapped in arrogance, worshipping steel and spectacle, the other clinging to life with creativity, building hope from fragments. Fortress versus innovation, empire versus underdog. And while Russia celebrated its tower as indestructible, in secret, a team of young Ukrainians was about to rewrite history. The tower was never just a building. It was Russia's crown jewel, a towering slab of concrete and circuitry rising above Moscow's skyline like a monument to invincibility. Officially, it was called the Moscow Defense Hub. Unofficially, it was Putin's shield, his proof that no foreign hand could ever breach the motherland. Night after night, state television paraded its image glowing under spotlights as commentators smirked at the idea that anyone might challenge it, but behind that smug performance lay a darker truth. Billions of dollars had been poured into its construction, not all of it clean. Contracts handed to oligarchs, kickbacks slipping through the shadows. Engineers warned of flaws, but were silenced, threatened, or replaced with loyalists. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it was a fortress built as much on corruption as on steel. Yet to the Russian public, none of that mattered. They were told it was perfect. And in a system ruled by fear, no one dared to question it. Putin himself stood before it. During parades, his voice swelling with pride as he declared Moscow untouchable. Clips of him smirking, wagging his finger at the West replayed endlessly. The tower wasn't just defense, it was theater, a psychological weapon meant to crush doubt and inflate fear. He framed it as the line between order and chaos, civilization and collapse. So long as the shield stands, state media boasted, Russia stands eternal. Yet the more Russia worshipped its tower, the more brittle its image became. Soldiers stationed nearby whispered about faulty radar. Leaked reports hinted at outdated software, sensors that glitched during rainstorm, defense systems that cost millions but barely functioned. Still, no one dared to speak aloud. The illusion had to hold. This was the villain in its truest form. Not just steel, but arrogance given physical shape. A tower raised on lies, polished with propaganda, and crowned. Moscow's pride was less a fortress than a monument to. While Moscow's generals clinked glasses beneath Ukraine's heroes worked in silence, far from the head. They were not commanders in decorated uniforms or men with medals pinned. They were students, coders, and weekend drone hobbyists, ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. In cramped basements and abandoned classrooms, they pieced together weapons not from billion-dollar but from scraps salvaged in the chaos of. Their tools were humble. Laptops running on backup, soldering irons glowing faintly in the cardboard boxes filled with toy parts, and candlelight flickered over exhausted faces, eyes burning from. Some had once dreamed of building apps or starting companies. Now they built lifelines for their country. Every screw tightened, every line of code debugged, carried the weight. What drove them was not arrogance or pride, but desperation and a kind of stubborn hope. Each missile that slammed into Kiev hardened their each blackout only fueled their creativity. Where Russia trusted in size, wealth, and intimidation, Ukraine leaned on something far more dangerous. Imagine they studied the gaps in radar coverage, mapped vulnerabilities, and taught machines to fly low, unseen, and with each failed prototype, they learned faster, adapted quick, pressed forward harder. Neighbors brought them food. Parents who once worried about exams and now whispered prayers over laptops and drone. Entire communities rallied around these quiet offering shelter, battery, or spare electronics. It wasn't one genius, one leader, or one. It was the collective heartbeat of a people who refused to. They became modern-day Davids, armed not with slingshots, but with humming wings and coded against a giant boasting towers of They wielded devices born of kitchen tables and garage. The contrast was almost biblical. One side flaunting fort, the other side whispering in the shadow, preparing the strike that no one saw come. And when their creations finally took rising from hidden launch pads into the cold night, Ukraine's spirit soared. These weren't just machines, they were symbols of defiance. But what happened next would test every ounce of their courage. The night they were unleashed, the skies above Moscow sounded different. Not the roar of jets, not the thunder of missiles, but something subtler, stranger, like a swarm of angry wasps in the distance. At first, no one noticed. The hum blended with the city's rhythm, the late-night traffic, the murmur of nightlife. But the hum grew louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. Ukraine's robotic swarm had taken flight. Small, agile, flying low beneath the cover of radar. They slipped under the electronic curtain Russia boasted about for years. They weren't built to impress parades. They weren't polished or flawless. But they were smart. AI-guided, coded to think faster than human reflexes. They wove through the dark like phantoms. Dozens of them, then hundreds, gliding straight toward the $1.3 billion tower. Russia scrambled. Commanders barked orders and interceptors launched from nearby bases. Surface-to-air missiles tore upward, streaks of fire cutting across the sky. Jets roared into motion, their afterburners shaking the ground. But the swarm was too fast, too many, too unpredictable. Missiles locked onto a handful, striking explosions mid-air, but for everyone destroyed, several more slipped through. The drones danced through defenses with eerie precision, hugging rooftops, diving between high-rises, weaving patterns no human pilot could replicate. And then, impact. A flash like daylight split the night as the first wave struck. The Moscow defense tower shuddered, its once pristine walls splintered by fire, explosions punching holes in its armored frame from the ground. People watched in stunned disbelief as smoke and flames spilled from the invincible fortress. Phones captured every second. Within minutes, Twitter, Telegram, and TikTok overflowed with shaky videos of $1 billion. Monument unraveling in real time. If Moscow's mighty tower could fall to homemade robotics, what else was vulnerable? Generals whispered of a new age. Wars where innovation outweighed budgets. Where software defeated steel. Meanwhile, in Beijing, officials sat silent, watching the footage without a word. China had invested heavily in drone technology, but seeing it deployed at this scale against the supposed fortress of a nuclear superpower sent shivers even through their ranks. The balance of power was shifting, and everyone knew it. Back in Ukraine, cheers erupted in basements and shelters as news spread. Soldiers on the front lines hugged one another, their morale surging. For the first time in months, Kyiv felt like the hunter, not the hunted. The underdog had struck a blow at the heart of the giant. But celebrations came too soon. At Moscow's humiliation, the Kremlin was already preparing its reply. The pride of a superpower had been wounded on live television, and retaliation was inevitable. And just as Ukraine celebrated, Russia unveiled a response that no one expected. The flames had barely settled in Moscow when the Kremlin struck back, but with fury. Within hours, Putin appeared on television, his jaw tight, his voice trembling with rage. He denounced the strike as an act of terrorism, accusing Ukraine of crossing a red line. The tower, he claimed, had not fallen to weakness but to cowardly sabotage backed by the West. His words thundered across Russia's airwaves, an attempt to turn humiliation into defiance. But behind the speeches, vengeance was already unfolding. Russian hackers launched a coordinated cyber strike against Ukraine. Power grids flickered, plunging neighborhoods into sudden dark. Banks froze, their systems overwhelmed. Even hospitals struggled as monitors blinked off mid-operation. The Kremlin declared this was only the beginning. Robot for robot, machine for machine, strike for strike. On state TV, anchors scrambled to reframe the disaster. Graphics showed missiles intercepting drones, even as footage online told a different story. Commentators sneered, "Ukraine cannot touch Moscow again. Our shield stands strong." Yet outside the glow of propaganda, doubts spread like wildfire. Because the truth could not be hidden. Millions had seen the videos, shared them, replayed. They had watched the billion-dollar tower bleed fire across the sky. In Kyiv, children huddled in shelters cheered. In Warsaw, in Berlin, in London, newspapers declared it a historic turning point. And in New York, traders whispered nervously as stock markets shuddered. If Russia's defenses were this fragile, what did that mean for the stability of a nuclear giant? Inside Russia, the silence was more dangerous than noise. In apartments across Moscow, whispers spread like smoke. If the billion-dollar wall failed, what else is a lie? Parents asked themselves if the promises of safety had always been theater. Soldiers stationed at the front questioned whether the weapons they carried were as powerful as they had been told. The myth of invincibility cracked, and no propaganda could seal it shut. In Ukraine, the mood was electric. In dimly lit basements, the same engineers who had once doubted their creations now watched with wide-eyed pride. They weren't just building drones. They were rewriting the rules of war. "We showed the world," one muttered, staring at a live stream replay of the explosions, that giants can bleed. But the story didn't end there, because the aftermath was even more unbelievable. History often glorifies steel, armies, and billion-dollar fortresses. But this war revealed something different: the true power of human ingenuity. Ukraine, battered and outgunned, had shown that intelligence, resilience, and courage could pierce even the most expensive shield. The robotic strike was not just an attack on a tower. It was a message to the world. No fortress is invincible. No empire is beyond challenge. In Kyiv, people no longer spoke of themselves as victims. They spoke of resistance, of innovation, of dignity. Parents told their children the story not with fear, but with pride. How ordinary engineers, armed with nothing but laptops and spare parts, had humbled one of the world's mightiest militaries. It became a modern parable. Proof that survival is not about size, but spirit. The strike carried a lesson far larger than the war itself. It was about the strength of the underdog, about small nations daring to stand tall against overwhelming force. It reminded the world that arrogance built on lies will always crumble when tested by truth. And it proved that the human will to survive, to create, to adapt, can outshine the darkest storm. For immigrants, for dreamers, for anyone who has ever felt outnumbered or underestimated, this story resonated. It was validation that courage and creativity matter more than wealth or power, that even in the harshest conditions, people can rise, innovate, and inspire. In the end, the billion-dollar tower was no match for human ingenuity. And that truth echoes far beyond Ukraine's borders. It echoes in every community that has ever been told it is too small, too weak, too powerless to fight back. And though the war rages on, one fact cannot be erased. On that night, David struck Goliath, and the world watched the giant stumble. The robotic strike changed everything, but it may only be the beginning. Because in the shadows of Kyiv's basements, whispers are growing. Whispers of designs far more advanced than the drones that stunned Moscow. Weapons guided not just by human code, but by artificial intelligence learning on its own. Machines that could rewrite the very definition of modern warfare. The Kremlin fears it, NATO wonders about it, and the world waits, breath held, to see whether Ukraine will once again defy the impossible. If a billion-dollar fortress could fall to handcrafted drones, what might collapse when the next generation of weapons takes flight? This is no longer just a regional war. It is a global story, a battle between innovation and intimidation, between resilience and arrogance, and the next chapter could be even more shocking than the last. So stay with us, because if this strike rattled Moscow, what comes next may shake the entire world. Subscribe now.